Welcome to the Hope After Child Loss podcast, where we endeavor to offer stories of hope to grieving parents and siblings so that they might rediscover life filled with meaning, purpose, and hope. We invite you to come and join us. Welcome, everybody. We're so glad you could join us for today's episode. I'm your host, Greg Buffkin, and I'm really excited to introduce you to my guest today. Her name is Teresa Davis, and Teresa is a practicing registered nurse, and she is also the author of a devotional entitled Finding Hope and Healing in the Midst of Grief, and she is also the host of her own podcast, The Grief Mentor, and she is a personal grief mentor. Teresa, welcome to our podcast today. So good to have you.
Thank you so much, Greg. It is indeed an honor to be here with you today and your listeners.
Oh, thank you. Well, Teresa, take a couple of minutes and just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a mature woman, so I'm getting up there in those years, that we say, on that side of life when you want to sit back and, take a break and not be as busy. Well, I've done the complete opposite of that, Greg. Grief changes your life, as we both know, but it has created an intense desire inside of my heart to walk along people that have suffered what I have suffered. And so I am ramping up instead of slowing down. But I'm a wife of 42 years. I have 6 grandchildren. I have 1 fur baby. We live in southern Indiana, just real close to Louisville, Kentucky, where the Kentucky Derby is ran. So Midwest, we live right there, socked in the middle into the Midwest. And I am learning to navigate life after child loss, and that's why I'm here today with you.
You are, let's say that you're well-seasoned and experienced in this season of life.
Yes, sir. And yes, that comes with many emotions to say, but yes, we're 5 years into our grief journey, and I have learned a lot about processing grief.
Yeah, that, people that are looking in from the outside don't really understand what a long and hard journey that can be. I think most people's perspective tends to be it's a very limited perspective. Most of us have experienced some sort of loss, whether it's a parent, a friend, a grandparent. So we all think that we know a lot about grief. And so often when parents who have lost a child are dealing with people who think they know about grief, it really can complicate that grief journey. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the episode. I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about your son, Andrew. I know that you guys lost him in a plane crash back in 2018, and I'm so very sorry for your loss, Teresa. If you would just tell us what you would like for people to know about Andrew.
Okay. Well, thank you, Greg, for your condolences. You being a grieving dad yourself, that means a lot. Andrew was 32 years old when his heaven day came, and he was a kid who knew what he wanted at a really early age. So at about 13, he had gotten the bug, to fly aviation, and we had taken him over to a little local airport here close to us called Bowman Field, where they were doing these introductory flights for kids just to get exposed to aviation. And Andrew got the bug at that point, and he never looked back. He was able to get his private pilot certificate here at home at a local airport, Clark County Regional Airport, before he went to Indiana State, where he double majored in aviation, professional aviation, with a minor in airport administration. And he was walking up that ladder that pilots do. Pilots, it's all about hours, and it's all about hours, pilot and command hours. So when you first start out and you're new, you get a lot of right seat hours, which is co-pilot, and you need those left seat hours. So Andrew had worked his way up through the corporate world because he was a family man. He loved life and he loved his family. He had 2 children, and he did not want to go that route of the regional airlines where you're away many, many hours. So the corporate route was the direction he took. It took him a little longer to get the hours that he needed. His goal was to be a UPS pilot. So he and Erica had lived away for all of their married life, and Andrew took a job. He was so tender and sweet about it because he had interviewed for a job here locally. He'd never lived close to us since he had graduated from college, and he didn't tell us about it until he actually got the job. So the day that he got the job, he came by unexpectedly and surprised us. So we were, so excited that we were going to get to do life close. We made a lot of effort. They lived out of town. We went there once a month, or they came here. We stayed in close contact. But to be able to do life one-on-one with one of your kids is pretty sweet. So we were happy.
Yeah, I'll bet.
Yes, very happy. So that's how he ended up in this job. He was the chief pilot for TEG, Wayne Stolpenall's company, when they moved back home.
Okay. And a job that he absolutely loved. And, as you were describing what he was like as a little boy, I mean, when I think about when I was young, the thought of being able to be a pilot, little boys think about in terms of fighter pilot. But I mean, just to be able to fly a plane and beyond that, to fly a jet. I mean, I just can't imagine anything more cool in the mind of a boy or a teenager for that matter.
Yeah, he was very excited about that. 100%.
I can only imagine that mom and dad might not have been quite as excited.
Actually, I was a little relieved because he began to think about the military route. Of course, and as moms and dads, we guide. We don't, we try not to heavily influence one way or the other.
Right.
And so I really kind of held back. His dad was all for it. I was not, because, the whole thought of being in the Air Force and being a pilot was a little nervous for me. But he decided not to go in that direction. So I was kind of relieved that he decided to stay home. Yeah. And he always told us, Mom, it's safer to fly in a plane than it is to ride in a car.
Did you buy that?
Actually, that he's right. It's true.
I know
That's
he
what
is.
The statistics were. So, I trusted him. I believed him, and I never looked back. I really didn't, Greg. It never, ever entered my mind that my son could ever die in a plane crash. Never entered my mind. I never worried about it. It wasn't something that was a fear for me.
Well, I know that was the compensation of not going into the military and becoming a corporate pilot. I can only imagine that did provide quite a sense of relief for you.
Yes, it did.
Yeah. And, I think that what you just said a moment ago, the thought never crossed your mind that he might, that job actually might cost him his life. I don't think that as parents, we go along as they're growing up and even as they become adults. I don't think that losing them really seriously crosses our minds until something happens maybe with a friend of theirs, or something happens to somebody who is in that line of work. I think it's such a foreign concept to a parent to think about having to bury your child, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not a natural. It's not a natural train of thought. I would agree with that. I mean, there's always fears, of course. When our kids start to drive, we start to have that anxiety when they don't come home at the right time, or they're running late and that kind of thing. But nobody ever really believes that it's going to become a reality in their life.
Right. It's those are the things that happen, and I don't mean this in a callous way, but those are the things that happen to other people. Mm-hmm. It doesn't happen to us, And I think sometimes even as Christians, we live this formulaic kind of faith that, if we do and you fill in the blank, or if we don't do and you fill in the blank, then that equals a really good life, not marred by things like losing a child. But that's not how it works. And when it happens, we are just so overwhelmed by the fact that it did happen, that it's hard to conceive of that that reality that just happened. And I think we try to push it out of our minds as fast and as hard as we can, because we just don't want to accept it.
Absolutely. I would agree with that concept, Greg. And that was probably, I would call it a crack in my foundation, because it was one of the factors that heavily influenced my grief, because I believed there was a couple of things that I believed that really made it much more difficult for me to grieve. And through my search in scriptures, I found out that, I had been misguided along the way a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, for one thing, I grew up believing 100% you pray and God will answer your prayers. And when you read through, Psalms, not that I believe that God answers every prayer that we pray, because we know that, he doesn't always answer prayers of healings. Sometimes he does. And so we know that not every prayer is answered, but I believed, because I prayed for a hedge of protection around my children, that God would provide it. If you go to the book of Psalms, you read over and over, I will go before you. I'll come behind you. I'll surround you. So I believed if I prayed for that physical protection for my children, he provided. So that made me feel like God was a liar when Andrew died, because he did not provide physical protection for my son. And the second crack in that foundation was, I believed if I lived my life, if I was raised Baptist, and all faiths, I think, have this somewhat of this component. But if I crossed all the T's, dotted all the I's, did all the right things, made the right choices, pleased the Lord, then my life would go well for me.
Right.
And Andrew dying, it did not feel good. So I felt like God betrayed me and God lied to me. So it took about 2 years, Greg, for me to process that.
Yeah. I think a lot of grieving parents struggle with that same issue and those same questions. I know that it certainly affected Kathy and me after we lost Ryan. And I know that you said, you wrote it, I can't remember if it was in your blog, but you said the eyes of grief sent you on a quest to see if you believed God was who he said he was. So what else did you discover about him on that journey?
Well, the God that I knew, Greg, sitting here in my office, if you could see my shelves, they're lined with Bible studies, because I taught women's Bible studies my whole life, and I've mentored women in the Word of God. But this God, the God that allowed my son to die, I didn't know him.
Yeah.
And so then I set out on a quest, because he felt like I really felt betrayed. I felt betrayed, and I felt like he lied to me. So I had to go find out who he was, because this was a foreign God to me. So I had to figure out who he was through his word and allow him to show me once I got to the place where I was teachable. So, I was full of anger. I was full of bitterness. I was full of, I would say, rage might be a little bit strong of a word, but I was very ungrateful.
Yeah.
For the things that I still had in my life, because I was selfish. I wanted my son back, and I was not able to process that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah. Did you believe that you were alone in feeling that way, Teresa?
At the moment, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I'd never known anybody that had gone through this, much less the feeling of and being able to verbalize. As Christians, it's not always accepted for us to say, I'm really angry at you, God.
Yeah.
I
Very
feel like
true.
you lied to me. And so I felt very alone. It was a very dark, dark time in my life. And I will tell you, if it hadn't have been for what I call my sister warrior praying friends, that I knew that I was in it was almost a dangerous place, Greg.
Yeah.
Because I was so angry at God. And, we had these shouting matches every night and these arguments, and I kept trying to find him in that darkness. And thank God for my sister warrior praying friends, because they prayed me out of a pit I couldn't get out of myself.
Well, that's a really important aspect of the grief journey, is having people that, like you were just describing, in our lives already in place. so that when the worst happens, you've got those kind of people that you could call at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I think that's probably what you're referring to here, because it's so important not to try to walk through that alone and try to process those feelings, especially those that are so strong and so all-consuming, the anger and the resentment and the bitterness and the feelings of betrayal. In grief, our minds are not normal to begin with. We have that, what we used to talk about when COVID was here, the COVID brain fog. Well, grief acts very much like that as far as its impact on our brains too. And so we need other people in our lives to help us process through those deep emotions. I think it's critical.
Your analogy is great. It's perfect. Yeah, with the COVID brain fog. It's a fog. The illustration that I like to use with grieving moms that I work with, it's like driving your car with fog lights on, but you can't really see.
Yeah.
You're just like, you're so lost and confused, and it's like being in a wilderness without GPS. It's like you have no direction. You don't even know what day it is. Time it stops. And it's a very disorienting place to be as a grieving parent.
Yeah, and that reminds me, there's this whole concept of after the funeral, most of the people that have surrounded us and that that came to comfort us and support us, and if you grow up in certain parts of the country, especially in Baptist churches, people shower you with food. It's what we do. It's we comfort ourselves with food. But once the funeral's over, most of those other people have to go back to their own routines, their own work lives, and just the stuff of life. And what you said a minute ago triggered this. A grieving parent feels like their life, time has stood still. And it's so hard to think about moving forward, because moving forward means that you have to do that without our child. The thought of leaving our child behind is such a painful, painful thought that it complicates being able to make healthy choices and decisions and move forward. Would you agree with that? Did you struggle with that?
Oh, absolutely. When your child dies, you're constantly, I call it living in the tension, because you're constantly thinking about when they were physically with you. And then you're constantly thinking about the future when they won't be. And there's this huge void between the two. And you can't figure out, how to get from one place to the other. So you just oscillate back from that, living every moment that you can remember when they were here, but yet that overwhelming sense of dread of the future, that they're not going to be in any more pictures. It's that horrible, terrible feeling of processing what has happened to you. And it's extremely difficult, I think, without assistance. Without somebody speaking into your grief and helping you process those moments. It's so overwhelming. You mentioned it earlier. It's like your brain, it's I like to call it an insult. You've had an insult to your brain and it doesn't function normally. There's a real thing called grief brain. And you're not able to make decisions. You're not rational, but yet you've got this paradox of, my child was with me and they're not. And how am I going to survive in that huge void between the two?
Yeah. Yeah. And as a nurse, you know this probably better than I do. There is also a very real impact physically. It's called the broken heart syndrome. And it manifests itself in such a way that sometimes people who have been impacted by a sudden death, whether it be a child or somebody else very close, they sometimes present themselves in the ER with classic heart attack symptoms, and most recover from it. But I think it shows that this is not just something that people feel. There is a physical impact as well. Sometimes people get stuck in what's called prolonged grief disorder. So the impact on our lives, it's so deep and it's so painful that it really does point to the importance of what you just said a few minutes ago, about not trying to do this alone, but having somebody, whether it's a counselor, whether it's a pastor, or just somebody else that you do life with, that you can share all of this with and have some input from them, or just to have them sit with you, because sometimes that's all that you need.
Yeah, you need people to listen, not give advice, and if that's
Yeah.
if you're listening and you're listening because you want to help somebody grieve. They don't need you to fix them. They need you to listen, because the expression of our lament, lament in biblical terms means passionate expression of grief and sorrow. And you see that throughout the Old Testament when they would grieve and they would literally tear their clothes, and they
Yeah.
would have this time set aside for mourning. Because Greg, you were perfect in your description of the broken heart syndrome, because if I walked up to you and my arm was dangling at my side and it was half connected, you would say, "Oh my gosh, you need to go to the hospital." But the broken heart of those that grieve is not visible, so it's not an outward sign, and it's something that if we're not able to express, in Matthew 4:5, I think it is, Jesus says that blessed are those who mourn, because they will be comforted. Mourning means expression of that grief, and we were not created, Greg, to hold it in. We were
Right.
created to mourn and let it out, and that expression of that grief relieves some of that intense anxiety and that fight or flight, that whole hormonal thing that takes place when we just heard that our child died.
Yeah. And you can't live continually with those kinds of hormones raging. It will have a very detrimental effect. So that's why the importance, that's why we're stressing, if you're listening today and you don't have anybody to talk with, please let somebody in, somebody that you trust, or please consider a counselor, a grief counselor, somebody who's trained to do this. It's an invaluable resource.
100%. And Grief Share, I don't know if you had an experience with Grief Share, but we did, and that's a great entry point for someone who has just lost their child, because it's a non-threatening environment. It's a video-driven course. It has breakout sessions. It's taking that first step to go is the hard part, but that's a great entry point too, for someone who is walking this road. Is Grief Share.
Yeah. That is a proven program, and it has helped so many people. Teresa, I think a lot of times people that are listening to us are hoping that there's something that we share that they can identify with. And I think one of the things that's so difficult for people is those first few days, those first few weeks, and even the first few months. Everybody knows you've got to get through it. You didn't have a choice in the matter. So you're facing this, but they want to know, Greg or Teresa, you guys have been through it. How did you navigate those first few days and weeks? What did you do that helped you guys? What would you say to that?
I would say the pain of the death of your child is suffocating. It's like an elephant sitting on your chest, and every breath you take is painful. When you're in that state of mind, it's very difficult to hear somebody say, "Well, you need to process your grief." Yeah, well, what does that look like?
Right.
For me personally, I knew immediately I was in way over my head, because Andrew's death was very traumatic. His plane went down at 11:34 on a Friday morning. I didn't even know it until 1:30 in the afternoon. I went to the crash site because I needed to see evidence that my son was no longer walking this earth. Please stop me. I was not, his plane went down in a very remote wooded area that was only accessible by ATVs. When I got there, the scene was of one that I'll never forget, because it's definitely left, a traumatic imprint in my brain. Because of all of the factors involved in his death, the police quit communicating with us because they had marked it off as it now became an NTSB investigation. No one was allowed there, in or out. They wouldn't communicate with us. The only person talking to us at that point was the coroner. They had released, Andrew had 2 passengers on the plane. It was the president, vice president of the company. They had released those names, but they wouldn't release Andrew's name. The cockpit hit first. He was, flying a multi-engine, 10-passenger jet falling from 10,000 feet out of the sky. So they couldn't find any DNA to identify Andrew. This went on till Sunday. So the trauma that we experienced through those days was extremely traumatic, as is any news of your child's death. I mean, it's trauma. There's just no
Right.
other way around it. So I knew that I was in way over my head, and I immediately sought counseling. And that was my lifeline, Greg. Processing and going through all these things that I was going through nightly because I didn't sleep for about a year. The times that I would spend in prayer, and the times finally when I reached a place where I have a very unique story about that. We probably don't have time for that today, but something the Lord used to really impact my life and turn my journey around. Once I reached that place where I could allow the bitterness to, come out of me, that's when I became teachable, and the Lord began to mold me. Just like the potter's wheel, he
Yeah.
began to take me and he began to mold me more like his son through the study of his word. But all of that was going on at the same time. But to answer your question, when you're in those very early stages of grief, the only thing you want to do is isolate, and that's the worst thing you can do.
True. It's easier not to have to engage with people, when it hurts that bad. Because if you have to engage, it means you've got to deal with it. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. We know that. But there are healthy and unhealthy ways to grieve. And so we do have to make conscious choices to let other people in. And Teresa, there are moms that are listening right now, and they are maybe days or weeks into their loss. And the pain is just overwhelming. It's like somebody asked us just a few months after she lost her son to suicide. She asked us, how long is it going to hurt like this? What would you say to that mom who's listening to you right now?
It's going to hurt, and it's never going to go away, because your love for your child is never going to end. You will always be their mother. You're going to always be their father. So to make it to where it's explainable, it's like the pain begins to lessen in intensity as you begin to process your grief, get your questions answered. The thing I see grief, Greg, like hurdles in a field. And so all of us have that first hurdle, right? That we just can't get over. For most of us, it's that why question.
Yeah.
And so for me, what I would encourage moms and dads to do, that pain is always going to be there, but it changes over time. It's not always going to be that intense if you take the steps to manage those hurdles. That's key, because one thing that can happen to us as grieving parents, if we bottle it up, we stuff it down, we tamp it down in there, what we're doing is burying those feelings alive. And eventually that's going to erupt like a volcano.
Yeah.
So, you don't want to be 5 years, 10 years out from your child's death, and all those feelings are still down here buried alive, because it's just waiting to, if it hasn't already destroyed your life, it's going to, because you can't bottle that up. It has physical, mental, emotional, spiritual effects. So what I would encourage people to do when they say, how long is this pain is going to last? Well, it depends on you. It depends on what you are willing to do to process that grief, and stare that hurdle in the face and do what you got to do to be able to process it. Because those wins, Greg, it's so significant. And I encourage my grieving moms to journal, or at least write down something or some way to be able to go back and look at where you were then and where you are now. Because the little wins that we have in grief, and little, Greg, that might be staying out of the bed all day. That might be eating a meal for the first time. That might be stepping outside and taking a walk for the first time. Those are the kind of wins I'm talking about. And they're little, and they get unrecognized because grief is so overwhelming. The little bitty steps that we take seem minuscule. However, those little bitty wins is what brings us confidence, because grief puts our life out of balance.
Yeah.
Extremely out of balance, right? So you've got to find a way to bring those, I always like to have people picture the scales, with the bar at the top, and it has the bars that hang down and the cups in the bottom. They're way out of balance, and you got to be able to figure out a way to bring that balance back to your life. That's when that pain starts to change with a different type of intensity, because you go from, I'm never going to be able to survive this, to seeing that there is a way to survive it with intention.
Yeah. How long would you say it was before you really felt like you were going to experience life again with meaning and purpose like you had before?
I would say for me, I had a lot to work through, Greg. So for me, it probably took about 18 months.
Yeah.
And my personal opinion is early grief is the first 2 years in child loss. It is the most devastating loss that affects parents. And, the first year is pure survival. It really is. I mean, there's so much emotion involved in that, all the first and all the things that you dread. It's a pure year of survival. I don't even think most grieving parents even begin to really start processing their grief till that first year is over, because it takes about that long for us to realize my child is really not coming back.
I would very strongly agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it takes, after that second year, I think for me personally, is when I began to see I'm never going to be that same woman I was.
Right.
But life can still be good again.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes I think that being able to accept that and believe that can be very hard, because it means that you're closing a door that can never be opened again. And it's a hard thing to do. And sometimes there's guilt that goes along with it. If you're listening today and you're not there yet, lean into it. Don't run away from it. And you will discover that there's hope again, and you'll discover joy again. You really got to lean towards God and not away from him.
And I'd like to say this, Greg, if I could. The way that I processed my grief and come to a place where I could live my life again is by processing it and framing it as, I'm not leaving Andrew behind. I'm taking him with me.
Absolutely.
Because right now, my life with my son has been put on pause. It's not over. And so that finality that we can often feel about death can often keep us from reaching a place that we feel like that our life is worth living. But if you frame it in what the possibility and what the truth is, discerning truth from lies and grief is spiritual warfare, 100%, I believe.
Yeah.
And it's with our thoughts. So for me personally, I'm not leaving Andrew behind. I'm taking him with me. He is on this journey with me. His memories are going with me. His life that he lived meant something. He had an impact on this world. And I've got proof of that. And I know that there's more to come. So I'm just living in the pause. It's not over.
Yeah. And I think when we reach the place where we can actually focus on celebrating our child's life and all of those good memories and the impact that they had on us, I think that's when we are actually able to get healthier and move forward.
And that's different for everybody. That's that void we were talking about in the beginning, that place when you're living when they were here physically, and you're living here in the future when they're not, and that big void in the middle. When you're able to process that void in the middle, you do move from that place. I call it, coming to the crossroads. You come to the T at the end of the road, and you have to make a choice. Am I going to live in this bitter, angry lane? Or am I going to learn to process my grief where I can reach a place where I can literally honor my son? Because I personally believe that we are the living legacy of our children. So what do you want that to be? What do you want that to be? And how we live our life reflects on the legacy of our children.
Yeah, I totally agree. One last question. I think this is one that a lot of grieving parents struggle with. Dealing with others who sometimes are a bit insensitive, who sometimes say things that they probably should not say, probably because they are very uncomfortable around us and they want to help, but they don't really think through what it is they say. Sometimes it's because people just tiptoe around us, and sometimes it's because people just totally avoid us. How did you guys deal with those folks?
Well, I have two views on this, Greg. I tell my folks, surround yourself with safe people when you're grieving. A safe person when you're grieving is someone who's there for your benefit. They're not there with an agenda. They're not there to fix you. They are safe. They are not going to put you in a position to where you feel on edge. Now, we cannot completely control our environments. In those early stages of grief, absolutely, I controlled my environment. I did not spend time with people that made me feel like that I was going to run out the door and lose my mind. I created an environment around me of people that I trusted, that I knew was safe for me, that did not try to force or put their expectations of grief, because this is a very tender place, very vulnerable place in grief. And the things people say and to us can heavily influence the way we grieve. So I encourage people not to completely isolate, but to choose who you spend your time with. Now, on the flip side of that, to you said, people generally want to help. And this is what I encourage people to do. Have grace when you can have grace, because we didn't know what we know until we knew it, right? So
Right.
I like to encourage folks, you can tell when a comment is coming from a place that is not genuine. Maybe not in the very early stages of grief. Sometimes people get diarrhea of the mouth, Greg, and they don't,
Right.
they don't know what to say, and they just, but if that is somebody that you know really well, you can kind of overlook and forgive. But if someone says something to you that's offensive, I have a whole set of responses that I've created throughout my grief journey, because I've had some people say some extremely inappropriate things to me. Most child loss is traumatic. And so people want to know details. Well, guess what? They don't get to know the details. And so they will probe and they'll ask. For those folks, I created some strong boundaries with my verbiage to let them know they've crossed the line. So it's kind of that balance of finding a place where, if you know the heart from which it came, you can extend a little bit of grace. But if it's a person that's not safe for you, that you feel like is not allowing you to be yourself in your grief journey, then I would distance yourself from that person. Set up those boundaries. Say that, I would say to people, somebody, asked me a very inappropriate question. I'm not going to repeat it. But my response to them was, I'm not going to talk to you about that right now. That kind of thing, it's hard to come up. So I teach my grieving moms things to say, have little things in their pocket to pull out, because one of the things that makes us want to isolate is that we're afraid. We go to the grocery store, what are they going to say when they come up to us? And then what
Yeah.
are we going to say? Right? It's that very tender, vulnerable place that we're anxious about. So it's like, that's how I teach my folks. Surround yourself with safe people and learn some language to be able to set some boundaries when it's appropriate.
There's a lot of wisdom to unpack in everything that you just shared. I may have to go back and listen to that again. Teresa, I want you to spend a little bit of time now. Tell us a little bit about your book, the devotional, and I want you to tell us a little bit about your podcast, because there are people that are listening to this podcast that might very well benefit even more from hearing you.
Well, thank you for that opportunity, Greg. So the devotion book that I wrote came about, there's a story, and I'll keep it short. I think it's so important to get outside. So if you're listening to me, the getting outside when you're grieving does multiple things. It keeps you in the present because you're feeling the breeze, you're feeling the sun. We need that vitamin D, and it's important to do that. I would go walk. I would just walk. I would walk for hours at a time, because that brought me solace. And it allowed the Holy Spirit to speak to me. So one day, I kept hearing the Holy Spirit, not audibly, say to me, he wanted me to write it down. I didn't know what that meant. Write it down. And that's all I heard was write it down. Well, eventually, I come to understand that he wanted me to write down my spiritual journey. And that's what that book is about. It's the spiritual journey that where God took me after I got teachable, and he began to show me answers to every one of my questions in the Word of God. And that is what is written down in that devotion book, is my spiritual journey.
Hmm.
Yeah. And
Wow.
then my podcast, of course, it's called The Grief Mentor. And I share my life. I share the tools that I've learned and what the Lord has equipped me with to be able to help grieving parents face and live without their child physically on this earth. It's, as I mentioned to you before, there's a huge element of spiritual warfare that's involved when grieving the death of your child. Because if the enemy can feed us a line and we swallow it hook, line, and sinker, he can take our life from us. Maybe not physically, but he can take away our will to live. He can take away our ability to face tomorrow. And I'm not going to let that happen to the people that I care about. And he put it on my heart. I first started sharing my grief a little bit, bits and pieces on social media. And then he opened a few doors for me to do some public speaking. And then I clearly heard him say, I want you to start a podcast where you can reach more people. And I had no clue what I was doing, Greg. I had no clue. It's just, it's amazing what God will do with our yes.
That is so true, because I didn't have a clue what I was doing when I started this podcast either. And it still amazes me that a guy like me who is so untechnical, that's not even a really good term, could actually pull this off. So I totally do get that. And yours is a weekly podcast. You are sharing from your own personal grief journey and your own experiences and training. And I would encourage anybody who's listening today to please check out that podcast. Again, it's called The Grief Mentor. Very, very simple. Well, Teresa Davis, what an honor it's been to have you on our podcast today. I'm so glad that you could carve out time from your busy schedule.
Well, like I said, it's an honor for me to be here. And Greg, you're doing a great job. And you're getting, the more we can talk about grief, the more it normalizes grief and it doesn't stay in the shadows where the enemy can do his work. And so God bless you in what you're doing and getting the word out to help bring light into people's journey. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. As you well know, it is indeed a privilege. If you find our podcast meaningful, we invite you to follow us so that you can automatically receive the latest episodes. Also, we'd like to invite you to contact us and talk with us about sharing your story on a future episode, because every story is important and matters to God. Please reach out via email at hope@emptychairendeavor.com. That's hope@emptychairendeavor.com. And as always, thank you so much for listening.